ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Garot podcast. My name is Howard. I'm here with Chingachgook, and I do want to extend the warmest of welcomes to everyone, new and returning. If you are new, then I do want to encourage you to look back at some previous episodes, because we're going to be using terms that we have already defined. Terms such as meta and thumb up, tangibility, thumb down, the logos, freestanding claims, barbing, the Persig knife, and being on the front of Persig's train. If that sounds like nothing you have ever heard before, then you must most definitely make your way back to listen to the previous content. And then you will be able to follow the next stages of what we will be talking about today. I really like the way the previous episodes have been going. And in keeping with that, today on this episode number 5, I believe, the subject matter will be peculiar in a certain way for at least you and I, because you and I are individuals who have been fortunate enough to receive formal training in things like philosophy. So, similar to the way that we use a lot of these terms in our common parlance as shorthands for previously established ideas, if we were to step slightly outside of the parameters of that little circle that exists specifically between you and I, one of the things that I've begun to notice as time has gone on and as the distance of time grows longer and longer between the present and those days that I was able to sit in on philosophy classes and listen to philosophy professors lecture and whatnot, I am beginning to notice more and more that the fundamental givens that exist inside of a philosophy program, or they should exist inside a philosophy program, do not really have reliable analogs in wider civilian life, if I allowed myself to use that term. One of the things I greatly respect about Western philosophy in particular is its characteristic of systematically rooting out things that are contradictory and also establishing clearly why certain things belong to this category entitled fundamentals. Now, what is particularly interesting about this category we're just going to temporarily call fundamentals for the time being is that when they are not elucidated, when the case for the things that belong inside this category is not stated explicitly, you cannot reliably expect the person sitting across from you to affirm the same thing. What I'm trying to get at is this situation that I'm beginning to find myself in. I have to go back and dig through the very, very basic content of what was established in what I'm just going to call Philosophy 101. And that's functionally going to be what we're going to be revolving around in this episode. Because even though it is fundamental, for the sake of our audience, those listening in at home, for the sake of ensuring that the toolkit we are trying to assemble currently is as complete as possible, it is important that we use the time of this episode to dig into something that at this point seems almost childish. But nevertheless, we need to be able to demonstrate clearly, reliably, repeatedly the tangible explanations for why this principle goes into the toolkit. That's a lot of thumb up talk, granted. But what we're going to be talking about today is what you and I term universalizable principles. Now, the mechanic of this idea is not unique to us. It's not unique to a particular sect of philosophy, or the idea behind this term is not some arcane terminology. It's been a couple years, but
I noticed that one of the public figures that you used to follow on a, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe it was a semi-regular basis, was such public figures as Stefan Molyneux, as an example. Personally, to date, I have not been exposed to much of Stefan Molyneux's content, so there's not much commentary I can give directly on him. However, we do have a copy of his book on the shelf. It's the book about a case for universal rational ethic. Well, I forget, what's the title of the book?
The title is Universally Preferable Behavior.
That's right, Universally Preferable Behavior. So the extent of my understanding of his content comes from universally preferable behavior. And what that book, based on his own introduction, is trying to do is trying to make a case for saying there exists a certain set of principles, and these principles always apply. And it's based on these fundamental principles that always apply that we can construct an entire system that informs the individual of the choices the individual ought to make or the behavior the individual ought to engage in, what have you. It's functionally a work on ethics in the philosophical sense of the term. From that, and again, I stress that this is not a term that is unique to Stefan Molyneux by any means. The idea of principles that universally apply is a concept that comes out of, like I said, philosophy 101. You need to have some sort of basis to agree upon, otherwise you have nothing left to talk about. And one of the things that comes out of that is a sort of sister term called self-referential coherency. Now, I want to tell the audience a little bit of a story with this, because what a lot of this content is, whether it be a term like universalizable principles or a term like self-referential coherency, a lot of this is a response to a position. I don't even dare call it a school of thought because it's not a school of thought. It's inherently asystematic. So we'll just call it a position. A position called relativism. So you have two poles. So if you imagine a straight horizontal line, you have things like universalizable principles, self-referential coherency on one hand, and then on the other side, you have relativism. Now, what is relativism for our audience sitting at home for whom these are new terms, these are new ideas? You might have heard it, but like with a lot of the content in this podcast, you're not quite sure how to articulate the precise definition. Relativism is the claim that states there is no absolute truth. All relativism can functionally be boiled down to that freestanding claim. There is no such thing as absolute truth. I really want to be diligent about this in explaining why it is that relativism, as it is encapsulated in this single freestanding claim, is detrimental to any idea, it's detrimental to any position. Now, the way I was taught in high school to respond to relativism was to demonstrate the fact that it was self-referentially incoherent. The idea being that things that are self-referentially incoherent cannot be true. It's very strange for me to talk about this because it seems obvious on its face, but if someone were to look at me and say, well, why not? For example, I'm just going to say, that which is self-referentially incoherent cannot possibly be true. The person sitting across from me responds, well, why not? It's not immediately clear to me how I would explain why. I mean, I could kind of fumble around a bit because the way I was taught in high school was to ask a snarky rhetorical question that stated, so there is no such thing as absolute truth. Is that an absolute statement? The idea being that the claim there is no such thing as absolute truth in and of itself is an absolute statement, which means that it automatically invalidates what it's saying because it itself qualifies as the thing that it proclaims does not exist.
It's a reasonable example.
One of the things that I notice about a lot of our conversations, particularly when it comes to the question of developing arguments when it comes to the question of trying to construct freestanding claims. One of the things that you always talk about is needing to ensure that these freestanding claims are self-referentially coherent. You say that a lot in our private conversations. What I hope to accomplish in this episode is to provide our audience a succinct definition of self-referential coherency, a succinct definition of universalizable principles, and what comes out of that. I want to leave our audience with tangible tools to both identify and refute dismissals or attacks based upon relativism. Why is relativism so incontrovertibly detrimental?
Relativism, the term at the moment, doesn't have the distinctions that it needs to have within the definition of the term relativism. So I want to look at relativism as a term with a little bit more scrutiny, because relativism itself, as a concept, has utility. Things that are relative assessments are not always a reprehensible procedure.
Might I push back on that a bit? And the way that I want to make sure that we're establishing appropriate parameters in this investigation is with something that Dr. William Lane Craig said. Dr. William Lane Craig is a theologian and a religious and moral philosopher. He also does some cosmology stuff as well. But he is one of the most prominent individuals in the sphere of Christian apologetics for the past couple of decades. I believe he has been at, for a long while now, Biola University with their Talbot School of Theology. And one of the things that Dr. Craig said might actually illuminate these parameters. He was actually on stage one time with Dr. Jordan Peterson, and there was a third female individual. She's Dr. Goldstein? I'm not sure. I can't remember. But basically, it's this female professor, Dr. Jordan Peterson, and Dr. William Lane Craig. They were all on stage, and they were discussing the question of, does life have meaning? If you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend it both to you, Howard, and to any of our audience sitting at home. I do believe that the entire debate/discussion is available on YouTube. It was very interesting to see those two figures, particularly Dr. Peterson and Dr. Craig, on stage together. But the female professor was saying to Dr. Craig something along the lines of putting forward a atheistic argument, not needing spirituality or God, and relativism came up. The idea of what you were just talking about right now about the useful procedure of being able to make relative claims, relative comparisons, or what have you.
I'm going to call it relative assessments.
Sure, relative assessments. And he stated rather emphatically that the content that would fall in under the category of what we were calling relative assessments does not belong in the parameters of a discussion about relativism in and of itself. And one of the things that he pointed to was the conflation in civilian society, for lack of better terms, between Einstein's theory of relativity and how general mass market atheists took Einstein's theory of relativity and then construed that into a claim that said everything is relative. There is no absolute truth. All absolute claims are inherently bogus. And Dr. Craig pushed back very strongly and said, these two things don't connect. This is a non sequitur here. The utility of relative assessments, or Einstein's theory of relativity, the need to be able to draw conclusions of comparing one thing to a next, this has nothing to do with relativism in and of itself. And so it's perhaps important to laterally drift around this because one of the low resolution defenses of relativism that tries to push back against universal principles, universal applicability, self-referential coherency that applies, quote unquote, universally, is to say, oh, well, you have a claim that it is raining right now, but that's not a universal claim. You can't universally apply that because you have to see sometimes it's raining and sometimes it's not raining. No. We need to very clearly distinguish between a diligent rebuttal to relativism and these low-resolution conflations of relative assessments. This idea is this notion of set. What do I mean by set? If a claim just applies to a particular set, that in and of itself automatically qualifies under the category of, let's just call it absolute truth, absolute claims, and does not in any way support relativism. So for example, all of the marbles in this cup are blue. Well, see, that demonstrates relativism because there are other marbles in the world that are not blue. It's not what I'm talking about. The statement is tied to this particular cup. You don't get to hold up a red or a yellow or green marble and say that the claim in question is somehow relative. It's applied to a set.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure that we're being abundantly clear about that for the audience sitting at home and making sure that we are able to distinguish that from the problematic form of relativism as it is embodied and encapsulated in the statement that proclaims there is no such thing as absolute truth.
The reason that I was bringing up the utility of a relative assessment was because I'm trying to bring the knife down between the relative assessment and the always problematic relativism category, however we're going to refer to it. Relative assessment versus relativism seems a little bit close in the terminology, but that's part of why I wanted to bring it up. I agree with your distinction, and I really like the way that you concluded that, which was to say that relative assessments are made in the context of a set, like you were just saying. But the thing is, even though it's valuable to be able to say, within this set or within these parameters, there are more blue marbles than yellow marbles, those kinds of comparisons between two things can be invaluable. But in order for those comparisons to be valuable, the scope of the parameters needs to be absolutely clear. If you have a situation where the scope of the parameters are set, those relative assessments within that specified set of parameters are not going to be universalizable because of the parameters in place. Because they always have a scope on the set that we are assessing, these claims can't be universalized because you have to remove those parameters and apply that to all circumstances that the claim can be applied to. Where you're saying, for example, it rained more today than it rained yesterday. You might even have to be very, very specific and say it rained more today than it did yesterday on my house. It rained more today than it did yesterday on my house between the hours of 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. If you remove the parameters, then you would be saying, no matter where you were, it rained more than it did before, which is obviously not true. But you also have to be able to bring the thumb up enough because rain itself is not a contradiction, but rain and not rain at the same time would be. Essentially, the reason why I was bringing up relative assessments was because comparing two things within a rigidly established scope can be extremely productive. But because you have that scope, you can't say that it applies to all things because otherwise the utility of establishing the scope is gone.
Well, but more importantly, it's not a defense of relativism.
Well, no, it's not. It's not a defense of relativism at all. It's actually a different term that uses the same word. So, relativism versus self-referential coherency if you're going to say that relativism is always a problem and self-referential coherency is never a problem, then they have to be incoherent with themselves. So that's a relatively easy exercise to do within the scope of those very rigid parameters. The idea being, if everyone operates under relativism, would that be a problem?
Yes.
It would.
Yes.
Would it even be possible?
In what sense? It's not self-referentially coherent.
The way to test whether something is universalizable is to say, if everyone behaved this way, what would happen? So if everyone behaved with these principles, would it even be possible for everyone to behave with these principles? Would it cause a bunch of problems for everyone? Does it cause the world to destroy itself, or would everyone be better off?
Okay, so here's a problem. And this is exactly the reason why we need to establish very clearly the definition for self-referential coherency and the definition for universalizable principles. Because what I have observed time after time again is the generic individual looking at that and saying, I don't need a situation where everybody is abiding by these principles. These are rules for me and these are rules for you. And that's what keeps the system going. I have heard these individuals use pathological analogies to things like the stock market and day trading, describing, there's always winners and losers. And someone makes money and someone loses money. Where they reference this entire system where it functions exactly because people are not behaving in the same way. What is not clear is that why is it that if you made everyone behave this way and the system implodes, here's the diligence point. Why is that a problem? Why is that detrimental to the thing under scrutiny? Why cannot the generic individual just say, even if everybody doing this would result in Armageddon, that still doesn't invalidate the legitimacy of the claim or the legitimacy of the position? That's the level of pathology this episode needs to deal with. Because you say, all we have to do is run the experiment and ask the question, well, what if everyone did this way? What would happen? There would be Armageddon. What do we say to the individual who looks at you dead in the face and says, so what? I don't care.
Like you were saying at the beginning, there has to be a way to agree upon something. And whether it's better to make the world a better place or to make the world a worse place, which would be self-referentially incoherent because then you're still trying to make something better by making it worse. That theoretically would be a point of agreement. Theoretically, that would be a starting point for wanting to make the world a better place. Are you referring to people who are also going to say that there's no such thing as better?
They would probably fall into that camp. The people that I'm thinking of in my mind would probably not even go so far as to articulate that much. People who proclaim that there's no such thing as better are a subcategory of the people that I'm referring to. What I'm more going toward in my memory are people who would rather proclaim there is only better insofar as I am concerned. If it benefits me, good enough. And that's a very, very boiled down version of this because the way it usually goes when it's actually talked about is a claim that goes, better only extends to me and my blood relations. If you are not related to me by blood, I do not care. Better is what benefits me and my blood relations. Which is why when you talk about the experiment of asking the question, well, what if everybody behaved this way? What would happen? Would there be Armageddon? These individuals would say, the fact that everybody behaving this way would mean that there would be Armageddon does not invalidate the legitimacy of my position because all I needed to apply to is my blood relations. And if my blood relations are able to benefit, then good enough. My position is legitimate.
There's supposed to be something more fundamental than that, which is, would it be better for you and your blood relations if there was Armageddon, or would it be better for you and your blood relations if the world was better off?
The problem is that these particular people would say what ought to be prioritized is that which maximally benefits my blood relations, even at the expense of others. You're trying to say if everybody engaged this way, you and your blood relations would receive nothing, would receive disaster. The response is not, oh, then we better not behave this way. The response is, well, then how can we construe a situation where we are the only ones behaving this way, but everybody else doesn't? One set of rules for me, another set of rules for you. That's the seat of the relativism that I'm trying to get at.
Rules for me and not rules for you still operates under a principle, and it still operates under a principle that has to operate under the meta. So these things shouldn't be unable to be fed back into this machine of asking whether or not it's universalizable. How do we make the rules so that we benefit and no one else does? Well, there has to be a way to benefit at all. Just because you're using universalizable principles doesn't mean that you're not benefiting, which is another problem that we need to deal with in this formulation. Someone who's saying, I want to benefit and I want my family to benefit, that's not inconsistent with universal principles. Well, of course you do. So does everyone else, but that's okay. The problem is whether there's a way to do it so that everyone can do it at the same time, because if you can't do it in a way where everyone can do it at the same time, then nobody can do it.
That's what needs to be diligently demonstrated. Let's be very clear about this. You just made a freestanding claim. Quote, if everybody can't do it, then you can't do it either, end quote. These individuals would look at that freestanding claim and say, false. Of course I can. Now the question in this podcast is to demonstrate why are they wrong for proclaiming false?
Because the only reason that they can go against universalized principles is because of the people that hold them.
Okay, why is that a problem? Because these people will look at that and say, correct, so what?
Well, it's not a very grateful position to be in. If there are people with universalized principles, there can be people with principles that are not universalizable. If there are only people with no universalizable principles, there are no people. If good and evil were separated, good would be just fine. If evil was left on its own, it would cease to exist. There would be nothing good to corrupt.
That's just to say that the existence of evil requires the existence of good.
So the existence of evil requires the existence of good. The existence of good does not require the existence of evil.
Okay. So let's see if this fits. A principle that requires the existence of its opposite is bad. Whereas a principle that requires the existence of nothing other than itself is good. Therefore, if a principle that declares X requires the existence of not X, X is evil. And if X is evil, the individual ought not engage in X. Is that basically the structure of the argument that you're trying to outline? By tying a moral imperative into it?
It's rough, but let's keep it for now.
So, functionally, the pushback against the generic individual that I've been describing is one of a moral imperative. It is immoral to engage in this behavior, therefore you ought not engage in this behavior. Now this is where the subcategory comes in. At this point, the individual would have to declare whether or not there is such a thing as morality. Absolute morality.
The relativism card would come into play to say, oh, well, we can do moral relativism if that gets me out of the corner.
Correct. There is no such thing as something that is absolutely good or absolutely bad.
Or the epistemic card. You don't know what's moral. You feeble mortal have no authority over the definition of moral.
Again, we need to make sure that we don't leave our audience hanging. Why is it that all these pushbacks are all problematic? No, these pushbacks are wrong. If you ever smell or hear these pushbacks, they are false, and here is why.
It is nice to be able to meet other people and agree upon how to proceed and not consider yourselves outright enemies that are always trying to gain an advantage over each other when there's an alternative solution, which is to mutually gain more than you otherwise would be gaining by fighting each other. You're questioning the fundamental operating principles for social interactions. And there is a very important line to draw between people who are interested in mutually contributing to expanding each other's understanding and growth and work, for that matter, and someone who is otherwise engaging in social interactions to see how much material they can exploit from the individual that they're interacting with. There should be a procedure to acknowledge that that's what's happening so that you can stop incriminating yourself. But you're asking me about how to respond to someone that's not interested in finding a point to agree upon.
No, it's not that I'm asking you how to respond. What I'm trying to ensure is that our audience at home, when they run across these kinds of relativists, when they run across these kinds of claims, these appeals to relativism, that the audience at home will be able to look at them and say, false because A, B, C. Now, whether or not the relativist ultimately accepts A, B, C, obviously is a separate question. And being able to corner an individual who is so committed to pathological propositions and ideas will be the subject of the next episode. But for the purposes of this episode, I just want to make sure that our audience is able to have something tangible in hand that they can tell themselves, or anybody who legitimately follows the premises to their natural conclusions. This is the reason why appeals to relativism are false. This is the reason why a lack of self-referential coherency indicates that the claim that has self-referential incoherency is false. This is the reason why universal principles, universal applicability is the hallmark of any true statement. Because XYZ. Whether or not villains accept this logic is a question that we will have to deal with, but we'll deal with that next time. Because at the current juncture, we still have no tangible definition for self-referential coherency. We have no tangible definition for universalizable principles. And we haven't even touched upon the problem of arbitrary. What does it mean for something to be arbitrary? And why does the presence of arbitrariness indicate a false truth value for a claim?
We can continue to drift around some of these terms if that's our only option.
The terms are the tools that I hope to bequeath to the audience. So very easily we can retrace back to the question of self-referential coherency. What is the definition of self-referential coherency?
Okay.
Once we have self-referential coherency is defined as X, then we can say if a statement lacks X, you can conclude that it is always false because Y. So identifying the content of this X and Y, I think, is the way to proceed.
The formulation needs to be a little bit more precise. So self-referential coherency is a term that exists. It's a term that exists and applies to itself.
It's a condition. Would you disagree?
Yes, it's a condition. It's a condition that applies to a term. It could be a phrase, it could be a claim, it could be a set of specified things.
So an example of a self-referentially incoherent term would be a married bachelor. Married bachelor is not a sentence. It doesn't claim anything. It's just a single subject. Married bachelor has no predicate. But even though married bachelor has no predicate, it's just a subject, we can still say that this predicateless term is self-referentially incoherent because married and bachelor cannot coexist.
That would be a contradiction in terms, but that wouldn't indicate self-referential incoherency.
Okay.
Because what is or is not self-referentially coherent needs to be a condition that's applied after something goes through a certain filter. So after it goes through a certain filter or a certain process, then the result is the label self-referentially coherent or not self-referentially coherent. Maybe it doesn't apply to terms and it applies to claims.
Okay. it would also not apply to phrases then. Basically, in order for something to be self-referentially coherent or self-referentially incoherent, it must have both a subject and a predicate. Is that what we're settling on?
Yes, because my examples all meet those conditions that I can think of at the moment.
Okay. So then something like married bachelor would just be a contradiction in terms.
Correct. So in order for that to be determined as self-referentially coherent or not self-referentially coherent, what needs to happen to that term in order to make it not self-referentially coherent? To say that, for example, the man is married, and then to say the man is a bachelor, that would also be a contradiction in terms.
You could even combine that into a single subject-predicate sentence where the bachelor is married. Or you can even say bachelors are married.
So in order to determine the status of whether something is or is not self-referentially coherent, there's a test, there's a formula that needs to be applied to it. So it goes through a test process with a simple set of variables that you plug the claim into, and then if the equation balances, then the term is self-referentially coherent. And if the equation does not balance, then the claim is not self-referentially coherent. The idea is that both sides of the equal sign need to balance in order for the equation to be legitimate. And to say that both sides of the equal sign in a math equation don't balance, and that that's fine because my math is different than your math, is unacceptable. The process requires taking the term and feeding the term into itself.
The term or the claim?
It would be the claim. So taking a claim and then feeding the claim into itself. It might even be more than a claim that's required for something like this. Because we might be referring to applying whether something is or is not self-referentially coherent to a mechanism. This might only apply to mechanisms. And the reason that I say that is because if there's a mechanism and there's an input and an output of the mechanism, then what you do is essentially you attach the input and the output, and then you see if the mechanism survives. If you feed the mechanism itself, does the mechanism still stand or does it destroy itself? The mechanism that has no problem working with itself is self-referentially coherent, and the mechanism that destroys itself upon encountering itself is self-referentially incoherent. In the case of something like relativism, if I was going to try and use that as a mechanism.
The claim I encountered from high school. There is no such thing as absolute truth.
I suppose you can have a self-referentially incoherent claim, but...
How do you mean? What's giving you pause? Because your description about mechanics and mechanism and input, output, feeding it into itself, these are all very thumb-up claims. And they make perfect sense, thumb up, but what I'm trying to see is how can we bring the thumb down on it?
Well, what qualifies as a mechanism? The best place to start with trying to figure out whether something is or isn't self-referentially coherent would be with a claim that is something to the extent of self-referential coherency is itself self-referentially coherent. To apply the process to the term itself would be the most obvious starting point.
The problem is we still have no tangible definition of the term. All we know is that self-referential coherency is a condition, but we haven't defined what kind of condition it is. Self-referential coherency is a condition in which X.
I don't know how to specify the parameters. It's one of the big things I'm getting hung up on. So, self-referential coherency is a condition, or an attribute even, that's the result of a thing within the specified parameters. I don't know if that's term, claim, mechanism.
We can just use a representative variable for right now. So let's say resulting from X.
A condition that results from X. How do you not use the term in the definition? The condition, the attribute applied to X when X is referred to itself and doesn't become Y and stays X.
So this is what I got so far. Self-referential coherency is an attribute resulting from X being applied to X and not resulting in any change.
I might adjust that to X applied to X with resulting function and not dysfunction. And the reason why is because You can apply x to x, and x can be x plus. X can be x improved, and that's fine.
Okay.
But the problem is when x destroys itself.
Self-referential coherency is an attribute resulting from x being applied to x, and as a result, creating function rather than dysfunction.
Okay.
So that seems like a pretty nice frame, but we obviously need to fill in that variable.
So what is applied to itself?
What is x, right? We might be able to replace the second x with the word itself. Self-referential coherency is an attribute resulting from x being applied to itself and thereby creating function rather than dysfunction.
How do you apply x to itself? What would an example of x be? What if I said an attribute resulting from a principle being
claim.
applied to itself? Well, is it possible to bring the thumb down on applying a claim to itself?
Let's use the thumb down example from my high school experience.
Okay. There's no absolute truth.
So the claim that's supposed to be representative of relativism states there is no such thing as absolute truth. So that's a claim.
That's a claim.
So a claim can have one of two truth values. It can be true or it can be false.
Okay.
What we're doing is we are temporarily suspending the question of what is the truth value of the claim. And presumably what we are doing is that we are looking at self-referential coherency, and if the generic individual is presented with a claim, and the generic individual does not know what the truth value of the claim is, whether or not it's true or false, then there is a tool. All right, I cannot tell off the bat whether or not the truth value of this claim is true or false, but I have this test called self-referential coherency. So if a claim fails the self-referential coherency test, then I can conclude automatically that the truth value of this statement is false. If it does pass, maybe it's true. It might be false for other reasons, but it cannot be falsified on the grounds of self-referential coherency. Because what we're trying to do here is establish a tangible definition of the term self-referential coherency and then tie that to truth value. Because self-referentially coherent claims might be false. That's perfectly possible.
But something self-referentially incoherent is always wrong.
It's always false.
Or always false.
Correct.
Well, you opened up with the example of there's no absolute truth, and then that has to be absolutely true in order to state it. But there's a hidden claim within there's no absolute truth, which is to say, for example, claims cannot be stated. That would be a claim, but you wouldn't know what it was unless I stated it.
It basically functions as the same thing. Because claims cannot be stated is a proposition that has a truth value. It's either true or false. So how do you determine that? You feed it into this machine. All right, well, we're going to apply the claim that claims cannot be stated to itself.
I'm missing the procedure for how to do that. How do you derive where to put the claim? You should be able to just do it with the claim. This is why I've been hesitating on using the term claim as X. Unless you just want to grant that it's inherently obvious how to apply a claim to itself. I don't have the level of absurd detail required in order to bridge that at the moment.
Let's just run the example and see if we can harvest it out. So let's use yours. So we have a claim. The claim states, a claim cannot be stated. This claim has one of two possible truth values. It's either true or it's false. Now we are going to ask ourselves the question, is the claim, a claim cannot be stated, self-referentially coherent? Well, a claim cannot be stated. How do we apply a claim cannot be stated to itself? Well, is the claim being stated? Yes. I don't think there's any way we can say that the answer to that is no, because we have a hold of it. It's being stated either from someone else or in our own head. I don't think there's any way to claim that a claim cannot be stated is unstated. It's there. It's right in front of us. How do you unstate a claim cannot be stated?
Does that qualify as applying the claim to itself?
I think so. I don't see how it could not be, because the only way that you could get out of it is by saying that, quote, a claim cannot be stated, end quote, is somehow unstated.
Does that create dysfunction? We can also switch over to a claim can be stated, which reinforces itself.
Correct. I'm thinking back to that child's game where the puzzle is you have a couple of statues or monsters and they say one is always lying, one is always telling the truth, and you have to figure out which one is which. So it's like a problem of the statement, I am lying.
Yeah.
What's the dysfunction created from that feedback? Because if you are lying, then the statement, I am lying, cannot be true. It's a paradox.
Right.
How about if we change the definition from this? Self-referential coherency is an attribute resulting from a claim being applied to itself and thereby creating function rather than a paradox.
Okay.
So in the example of I am lying, is it true or false? Well, if it's true, then the statement I am lying is false. But if you are lying, then the statement is true, which means that you aren't lying. It creates a loop. It's a paradox. So in the same way, we have a claim cannot be stated. Well, we are going to apply that to itself. So a claim cannot be stated. Is the claim stated? Yes, it's stated. But if it's stated, then that means it cannot be possible that a claim cannot be stated. Therefore, it's a paradox.
Okay. A claim can be stated?
So a claim...
True or false?
True or false. So apply it to yourself. A claim can be stated. Is this a claim that is stated? Yes, it is. No paradox. Am I skipping something?
It's just not obvious how you get to the point where you say, is this a claim that's being stated? There is no absolute truth. True or false? Is absolute truth required to make this claim?
Yeah. Or
yes.
Is this an absolute statement? Yes. Therefore, paradox.
Therefore, paradox. Therefore, self-referentially incoherent. Therefore, false.
Correct.
That's the sequence.
That's the sequence.
Whereas something like a claim can be stated, true or false. Is this a claim being stated? Yes. Function, rather than paradox. Therefore, self-referentially coherent.
Therefore, may be true.
In terms of the tool, it's an initial test to put something through to automatically check to see if it's false, which would be consistent with a conversation that I remember having where an individual said, consistency is not a virtue. To which I responded, yes, but all virtues are consistent. So there's an initial test. It rules out a lot. You can understand a lot of things that you don't have to actually consider anymore.
I want to throw this monkey wrench into it just for the sake of being as thorough as possible. Like we were saying, it is possible for something to be self-referentially coherent and still be false, but it wouldn't be false on the basis of a lack of self-referential coherency. It would be false on the basis of something else.
Okay.
An example that's coming into my mind is the claim that states the Statue of Liberty is in Tokyo. So that's a claim. All right, so the Statue of Liberty is in Tokyo, true or false? Okay, is it self-referentially coherent? Well, we apply it to itself.
Can the Statue of Liberty be in a place?
Can the Statue of Liberty be in a place? Yes, it can. Tokyo is a place. Can the Statue of Liberty be in a place? There's no paradox there.
Can the Statue of Liberty be in Tokyo?
Yeah, it can be. It is possible for it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So it is self-referentially coherent, but we look up when we actually check the map. No, it's false. But it was perfectly possible for that to be the case. If the guy who, I forget the guy's name.
Could be at a later date. I don't know.
If the guy sent it to Japan as opposed to New York, then it's perfectly possible. It's just false for reasons other than self-referential coherency. That seems pretty solid to me.
It's the best I have right now. There might be a better way to bring the thumb down on it. The way that self-referential coherency would apply to universalizable principles would be to apply the definition of self-referential coherency to behavior, which is what led to the moral imperative statements before. So universalizable principles are self-referentially coherent behaviors.
There has to be an imperative there. Universalizable principles
I see.
are self-referentially coherent normative statements regarding human behavior.
The way that you apply a universalizable principle to itself is to ask if this were applied to everyone. At least that's a part of it. The implications being you can have self-referentially coherent principles.
Because a principle can be true or false. This is something that we need to make ridiculously obvious because a principle is a claim. For example, the statement, humans shed baby teeth, is not a universalizable principle because it's not a normative claim. It's a descriptive claim. It's just something that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So humans shed baby teeth doesn't qualify in this category of universalizable principles. All claims have either true or false truth value, but we can just get really specific here because universal principles have to be normative claims. They can't be descriptive claims. So normative claims are either true or false. Universalizable principles are self-referentially coherent normative claims regarding human behavior, which means that any normative claim that is not self-referentially coherent does not qualify as a universalizable principle. Not only does it not qualify as a universalizable principle, it's false. This is something that's really, really key here. This is something that's really interesting about the fork of false versus maybe true.
Mm-hmm.
What comes out of this is that we have to admit that it is possible for a universalizable principle to be false. It's possible. It's just it won't be falsified on the grounds of self-referential incoherency.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be false for something else. But like what you were saying earlier, what's interesting about the self-referentially coherent test is that anything that is not self-referentially coherent that fails that test automatically doesn't qualify.
Mm-hmm.
Automatically false.
Also, by extension, that the self-referentially incoherent normative claims, particularly as they pertain to human behavior, when you apply false to human behavior, the result of applying false to normative claims regarding human behavior is do not engage in that behavior.
Mm.
Which circles back to proper behavior has self-referentially coherent normative claims regarding that behavior. But that's where someone tries to get out of it by saying self-referentially incoherent claims. But the idea is that if you're looking for the self-referential coherency of someone's claims, and you determine their claims to be false because they're not self-referentially coherent, and then the response to that is more self-referentially incoherent claims, then you can theoretically keep looking at all those self-referentially incoherent claims and continue to regard them as false. So if the person wants to proceed in the conversation, then there needs to be a conversion of the type of claims that they're making to be self-referentially coherent claims rather than not self-referentially coherent claims. Because the solution to self-referentially incoherent claims becoming false is not more self-referentially incoherent claims, but its functional alternative, which would be something that is and does qualify as self-referentially coherent. It's very difficult to apply this process to some things, just because you get the problem of trying to put the box in a box to see if that's in a box. But if you try to put the box in a box and the box isn't a box anymore, then you can stop calling it a box and move on. That's good to know that.
One last bit I just want to make sure we cover. At the current moment, we have a pretty good working, tangible definition of the term self-referential coherency. Its opposite, self-referential incoherency, there's another term that's intimately tied to it called arbitrary. Now, I don't think we can say that arbitrary and self-referential incoherency are synonymous. However, like what we were doing with the truth value of claims and feeding them through the self-referential coherency test, there seems to be a parallel test called the arbitrary test. If something is arbitrary, that seems to have some kind of effect on the truth value of a claim that I am not certain how to articulate. And this is now starting to speak from my own personal experience when I've tried to speak with a wide variety of different people, where they would make a claim, and I would say, but that's arbitrary. And then the response would be, so what? And then I would be left trying to elucidate a problem that I knew was a problem, but I just didn't know how to tangibly explain the mechanics of what was going on. For the sake of being abundantly clear with our audience, what is the definition of arbitrary?
It's also an attribute.
It's also an attribute. I was just about to say that.
It's an attribute that results from a claim that's functionally interchangeable with its opposite, or functionally interchangeable with an unrelated alternative claim. It doesn't even have to be an opposite. There's an element of randomness that comes with a description of arbitrary. There's no origin that's specific.
So then what about this? Arbitrary is an attribute resulting from a claim being functionally interchangeable with a random alternative claim.
It has to be a claim that still functions within the context of the original claim. It's in the right direction.
It's in the right direction, but we need to nail down the phrase functionally interchangeable a bit more tightly. Because what does that mean? What does functionally interchangeable mean? The clause that states with a random alternative claim is fine, as is.
That's why I originally said an unrelated alternative claim. Part of it would be the idea that you can continue to generate another random thing, and it would continue.
There would be
the
no
context
change.
of the claim would continue to function.
So then functionally interchangeable is defined as a situation in which the claim's context doesn't change at all. There has to be a way we can feed that back into the original definition of arbitrary. Because I don't want a situation where we have a definition for arbitrary and then a definition for functionally interchangeable. There has to be a way to combine it all into one bit.
So that means I have a claim, and that claim has consequences. And I can replace that claim with its opposite. I can replace that claim with an unrelated claim, and it doesn't change the results.
So I have a formulation. Let's see if this works. Arbitrary is an attribute resulting from the consequences of a claim experiencing zero change when said claim is swapped for a random alternative claim.
It's the same consequences when you change the claim for a random alternative claim.
Right.
For example...
Well, hang on a second. I have a really specific place I want to take this.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So, like self-referential coherency, arbitrary also has an effect on the truth value of claims. But the effect is not the same as self-referential coherency's effect. This is the way I'm looking at it, and you tell me if I'm off base in any way. If a descriptive claim is arbitrary, it might be true. It might be false. If a descriptive claim is arbitrary, it has zero effect on its truth value. If a normative claim is arbitrary, it is automatically false.
I think you can do that. We still need examples.
Let me give an example of a descriptive claim and applying arbitrary to it. I have a bright green sock on my right foot. That is a descriptive claim.
Okay.
Is it arbitrary? Because I could swap it out and say that I have a bright green sock on my left foot. The consequences of those two claims seem to be identical.
What are the consequences? It seems to me that you would have to start with the claim, I have a sock on my foot. And then you could say, you have a sock on your left foot, you have a sock on your right foot, whether it's on your left foot or your right foot is arbitrary.
I like that. So I have a sock on my foot. The sock is on my right foot. True or false? Sock is on my left foot. True or false? It has no effect on whether or not there is a sock on my foot.
Correct. But specifying the consequences is important.
So then, in that instance, the sock being on my right foot is arbitrary. But just because it's arbitrary, it doesn't automatically falsify the truth value of the claim. It might very well be on my right foot, but I could have just as easily put it on my left foot.
Yeah. You can switch it out with this opposite, and then you still have a sock on your foot.
Right. It seems to be that we are okay in stating that arbitrary is an attribute that has zero effect on the truth value of a descriptive claim. Is there anything you want to add on to that before we move over to normative claims?
Just to reiterate that I have a sock on my foot, and then if I say I have a sock on my right foot, I either do or I don't. It's either on my right foot or it's on my left foot. So it's either true or false in the very simple way that we're laying out the structure of this, because obviously we're talking about things much bigger than socks as we apply this.
Mm-hmm.
But to say, first, I have a sock on my foot, then I have a sock on my right foot, true or false, it could be true, it could be false. It feasibly could be either.
Mm-hmm.
And it is arbitrary because it could be on your left
Right.
foot, and then the statement I have a sock on my foot would still be true.
Given that I have a sock on my foot,
Makes it
true
redundant.
or false, I have a sock on my right foot.
Yeah,
It's arbitrary.
it is.
But even though it's arbitrary, it is very possible that the sock is actually on your right foot.
Mhm.
So
Could be true, could be false.
I like that example. Given that there's a sock on my foot, true or false, there's a sock on my right foot. So let's shift gears and apply it to normative claims. If a normative claim is arbitrary, does that automatically falsify it?
Do you want to add ought to the socks? What comes to mind just with consistency here is, for example, I have a sock on my foot, and then the claim now becoming, you must have a sock on your right foot in order to have a sock on your foot.
You also have to apply it to the beginning part as well. Given that I must have a sock on my foot, true or false, I must have a sock on my right foot.
The answer to that would be false.
The answer to that would be false. Because you could have a sock on your left foot and you
And
would still fulfill
You
the
would still
imperative.
qualify. Yep. You want to do another one?
I want to do another one.
We might try and scale up the normative landscape a little bit.
I'm trying to scale it up right now. It's quite a daunting endeavor being on the front of this train.
Well, do you have an example of when you were trying to say that's arbitrary and then someone said, so what?
I'm trying to dig through my memory right now to see if I could rederive an example. What's interesting about applying arbitrary to a statement is that in order to determine whether or not something is arbitrary, it's double-pronged. It's always something in relation to something else. Given X, then Y. Then you can determine whether or not Y is arbitrary in relation to X. That's a pretty significant articulation.
Well, you have to be able to generate the alternative. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to call it arbitrary.
Right.
You have to be able to say, no, I could do this instead, and the consequences would be the same.
So let's start simple first. Let's try this example that usually arises when young adults are interacting with a certain breed of pathological elder. The pressure that elders put upon young adults to get married prematurely or just to hurry up and get married. So let's try this. Given that a man ought to get married, a man ought to marry someone significantly younger than himself.
Ought to? Well, you can't say ought to, and that's one of the biggest reasons why there's something inherently problematic about arbitrary claims, because you can't say that they ought to, because then that implies that they ought not do something that's just as functional, if not better. In the case where you say a man ought to marry someone significantly younger than him, then you would have to also say that they ought not do the alternative that can be substituted for it, which is, for example, marry someone the same age or older.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing inherently wrong with
Marrying somebody the same
same age or older. It produces the same consequences, which is the consequences of the opening statement, which is granted that someone needs to get married. So you can generate an alternative to replace it that's more favorable, that reaches the same results. And the reason why you do that is because it's better, and this person that you're speaking with is either going to agree that it's better to have the alternative with the same results, because you can do everything you could do before plus more, or they're going to say, no, you are going to not do the alternative despite the fact that it's better.
So this fits very nicely into the exchange that I was describing earlier. Somebody makes a normative claim, and then I respond, that's arbitrary. And then the generic person says, so what? And then with this formulation, I can automatically say, therefore it's false.
That's arbitrary. So what?
So it's false.
What you're telling me is false.
Correct. Because all normative claims that are arbitrary are automatically false.
Because you can't just substitute normative claims with random alternatives. Because you would be trying to accomplish a specific conclusion. So what you would do is you would set it up as, given that this is the objective, your statement that I ought to do X or that X is my only option is false because I can accomplish the same objective with Y. Is that sufficient?
I like that. This is a formulation I can already see that is going to become very useful in later episodes. This is definitely going to be content that will become recurrent. So I'm looking at this list and I kind of like what I'm looking at. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Given this objective that is stated from the other person, the statement that I must do X is false because I can accomplish that same objective by doing Y. So therefore X is arbitrary, and therefore the statement that I must do X is false. I might still do X, but it's not true to say that I must do X. Also, as a general means to showing respect to people, don't tell them they need to do things when they can do something else that's better, that accomplishes the same thing. It's better to contribute while mutually relying upon contributors than it is to not contribute and still rely upon contributors. All contributors, no problem. No contributors, paradox. Self-referential coherency is a means to doing good work. Take your work seriously.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Garot. Until next time. Vidario Esperante. Keep breathing, everyone.